Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, welcome to Milano Bicocca. We are homaging you with 4 traditional songs which touch upon the themes of this Congress. It's work, gender, prison, love and hope. And this is the cultural association Le Voci di Mezzo, who keep on traditions and bring them on and transmit them.
cambiare fondo, non sia più bestia. Se spera che i sassi diventan paneti, perché i povereti se possa saziare. Se spera che l'acqua diventa champagna, perché noi se lagna chi vuol giubilare. Se spera che il caldo principia in Genaro e senza tabaro poter camminare. Se spera che adesso non asa più tose, perché le morose se possa sposare. Se spera che il nostro governo non voglia in eterno le tasse lasciare. Se spera e sperando ne capita l'ora di andare in buon'ora col nostro sperare. Se spera e sperando ne capita l'ora di andare in malora col nostro sperare.
Devo mettere questo PowerPoint di Fast Time. So this is the official opening of the EASA, and I give now is going to speak the president of EASA, Thomas Hilland Eriksson.
Yes. Thank you, Sylvia. So, dear EASA members, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to the opening of this, the 14th biennial conference of the EASA in Milano, Bicocca. Social anthropology is perhaps in a paradoxical and unusual situation these days. A situation which may prompt perhaps future historians of the discipline to invoke Dickens and quote him to the effect of, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." Because on the one hand, this discipline is clearly thriving. The interest in our conferences is growing. There is an increased publication activity. There's an increased intensity in the professional discourse. And at the same time, we have a situation in many European countries and perhaps even across the continent, which reminds us of the fact that being an anthropologist in Europe or of Europe these days perhaps carries with it a special responsibility, which was not as palpable even at the last EASA conference in Tallinn. We have countries in Europe where there is harassment and persecution of academics and intellectuals like anthropologists, such as in Turkey. But even in the more benign and peaceful parts of Europe, there is a real sense in which anthropological knowledge, or the kind of knowledge that anthropologists typically produce, is not welcomed in the way that it may have been only a decade or two ago. There is an intellectual climate in which we now have to maneuver, where we cannot take it for granted that the outside world is initially generous to our perspectives, which is also a reminder of the fact that what we do is probably more important than it ever was. Sometimes one may think that if an economist and an anthropologist are in the same room and both of them are asked to give a talk, the audience will respond to the economist by concluding that what he has to say is really very important. And then comes the anthropologist, and they may conclude that, yeah, what the anthropologist has to say is really fascinating. And one of the tasks at hand for us in EASA is to show the world that what is fascinating can also be important. And when we decided on the topic, on the overarching theme for this conference, anthropological legacies and human futures, This may have been some of the things that we had in mind. The ability to look to the past in order to think ahead, to draw on 100+ years of anthropological research and anthropological knowledge in order to deepen our understanding and to sharpen our perspectives, and to make our engagement with the outside world even more acute than it was before. In what ways can we use the knowledge that has been accumulated and criticized and deconstructed and refined over the last 100+ years to come to terms with the challenges and the issues that are facing us today? These are some of the things that I personally hope will come out of this conference, and I'm confident that it will, because there are so many great people here and great panels and other activities. So on that note, I wish you some very productive and stimulating days here in Milan. Not too hot, just the right temperature for someone from Scandinavia. Okay? And the air conditioning is still working. So on that note, thanks for being here and thank you for your attention.
And now I invite Professor Gianfranco Pacchioni, who is Vice Rector of the university.
So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to be here tonight and to give you a very warm welcome in the name of our rector, Professor Cristina Messa. She could not be here today. Of course, warm in every sense, but if you organize a meeting in Milano in July, this is what you should expect. It's absolutely normal. So it's also I'm very pleased to see the lecture room, our aula magna, so full. I think I don't think I've remembered to have seen so many people, because it's almost 1,000 people which can be accumulated here. So it's a great success. Of course, our university is a young university. We have been created about 20 years ago. But it's a very lively university, and it has been created in an area which was also interesting from an anthropological point of view, because this was the whole area where we are now. It's about 1 million square meters, where Pirelli is an important company, had their factories producing tires and cables. And so where we are now is actually a factory which has been rebuilt and renovated. And we are in a place where workers were working until, I would say, 1970s, 1980s. Now we are a university of about 32,000 students, and we have 900 faculty members. We have activities in almost every field. We have a medical school and so on, natural sciences, economy, and of course, we have also anthropology, which is one of our strengths, I have to say. And this was created thanks to the initiative of Professor Ugo Fabietti. He is not here with us today, unfortunately, but we are, he's with us at least in spirit. And he has been very successful in creating a very strong school. And in fact, we have a master in anthropology, we have a PhD in anthropology, and we have very many active scientists working in anthropology. Some of them have been extremely successful also in getting recognition, international recognition. So I think is a right place to have this kind of meeting. And I hope you will enjoy your stay in Milano. You will sustain the temperature outside. Inside is a little bit better. So you will, is a strong motivation to attend the conferences. And for the rest, I can only hope to and wish you a great stay and a great success with your conference. Thank you very much.
I invite to speak Professor Maria Grazia Riva, who is head of the Department of Human Science for Education, Riccardo Massa.
Good evening to all of you. Just a few words. I am very glad to welcome you on behalf of the colleagues and staff of the Department of Human Sciences for Education, Riccardo Massa. We are very proud that the European Association of Social Anthropologists chose our institutions as its venue. We see this conference as a big opportunity to strengthen the anthropological and interdisciplinary tradition of our department. We believe in the role that human and social sciences can play in the positive transformation of society, especially in this complicated historical moment, as remembered before. Do think about what is going on in Turkish universities just now. The work of anthropologists paves the way to new educational models that cross cultures, religions, and social classes. I wish to thank Professor Fabietti and then Professor Alice Bellagamba, Silvia Vignato, Roberto Malighetti, and all the other members of the local committee for their efforts in the organization of such an important event. Moreover, without the students who volunteered, we would not be here. So, many, many thanks to them. And finally, I wish you a very fruitful conference. Thank you.
Now I invite to speak Professor Giampaolo Nuvolati, head of the Department of Sociology.
It's an honor for me, as the director of the Department of Sociology and Social Research, to welcome you and to host this conference. The conference has been organized together with the Department of the Human Science of Education. Let's say something about sociology and anthropology. As we all know, these are two different disciplines. However, they share a lot of theoretical and methodological approach in analyzing our society, especially when we deal with actors and situations of the everyday life. When we deal with the so-called interstitial space of our life, anthropology and sociology can contribute together to improve the analysis of the ongoing transformation, looking at the individual behavior as well as at the structural, cultural, and institutional frames. As I am also an urban sociologist, let me also add that cities represent nowadays a crucial context to look at in order to explore new anthropological transformation. And therefore, I am very glad that urban issues are at the core of this important conference. I would like to thank all the organizers of this event, Silvia Vignato, Alice Bellagamba, and Simone Ghezzi. But I would also thank you for being here. I hope you have time to visit this wonderful city that is Milan. Thanks a lot.
I now invite to speak Professor Roberto Malighetti, who is of our Department of Anthropology.
Thank you. Dear EASA members, conference delegates, and guests, I'm very pleased and honored to join my colleagues in welcoming you on behalf of the local committee and of the Dean of Anthropology in Italy and in Bicocca, the already mentioned Professor Ugo Fabietti, who is not present because of some health problems that we all hope will be solved very, very quickly. It is the second time that Italy hosts a major EASA event. The first was the inaugural General Assembly held in Castel Gandolfo in 1989 that marked the very foundation of the association. With more than 1,700 delegates, the 14th EASA conference is the largest so far. This can not only be considered a sign of the success of the association, it can also be regarded as the result of the conspicuous development of anthropology in Italy that only recently has come to a worrying slowdown. The 1999 reform of Italian university system granted anthropology a place that had been denied by the previous academic organization. Although the institution of the first chair of anthropology in Italy dates back to 1869, it was not possible to graduate in anthropology until the end of the millennium. There were only single courses with curricula in other social sciences or human sciences. The institutional changes brought by the Bologna process opened up the opportunity for a disciplinary expansion and for the creation of innovative programs capable to respond to the social demand for anthropological knowledge. A considerable number of universities launched first and second level courses specifically devoted to cultural and social anthropology. New PhD programs were introduced to integrate the existing ones created in the 80s. Postgraduate specialization courses and schools were conceived to complete the educational offer and to dialogue with the interlocutors outside the university and with the so-called third sector. Over the same period, the associations of anthropologists such as EASA and ANUAC, or the Association of Medical Anthropology, intensified their activities, while new ones were created, such as the Museum Anthropology Society and the Society for Applied Anthropology. The number of journals, publications, and translations increased considerably. If in 1977 there were 21 professors of anthropology teaching single courses in 16 public universities, today there are 153 professors. In 2008 were 209, concentrated in BA and master programs in social and cultural anthropology. This significant development is facing today a moment of worrying recession, due mainly to the neoliberal policies aimed to reduce the relevance of public education. The danger of a downsizing of the discipline is as real as contradictory when compared to the still growing demand of anthropology and the need for a critical anthropological thought solidly based on ethnographic research. In this problematic scenario, the anthropology at Bicocca has played the role of one of the main resistance points. Its rapid and intense growth has been fostered and protected by the need to develop this new university and by the efficient commitments of the founding fathers. Today, it hosts the largest Italian group of anthropologists, 13 professors, 5 postdocs, 30 PhD students, and a master program in cultural and social anthropology, which since 2002 has attracted about 100 students from all over Italy every year. It also offers the only PhD program in social and cultural anthropology in the country. All other PhD programs in anthropology have been closed, hit by the cuts to education. Anthropology at Bicocca has offered 3 postgraduate courses in applied and medical anthropology, in anthropology of migrations, and in cultural heritage. We have founded a research center and 3 journals. Of these, only one, Anthropologia, a peer-reviewed and open access journal, has survived the lack of financial resources. The hosting in Bicocca of the EASA Congress ratifies these notable achievements and questions a crisis that is not just national and does not affect only anthropology. It invests the social roles of intellectuals in a society dangerously nourished by obscure pulses and incapable to think. I'm sure the Congress will succeed to analyze and propose valid contributions to understand the complexities and the dramatic problems of the contemporary world and to operate among them. Ringraziandovi quindi tutti per il vostro impegno e per la vostra partecipazione, auguro a tutti buon lavoro. Thank you.
And now I invite Professor Didier Fassin as a keynote speaker of this conference, whom will be introduced shortly by Alice.
So, it is time for the keynote speaker, Professor of Social Sciences at the Institute for Advanced Studies of Princeton and Directeur des Études at the École des Hautes Études in Paris, Didier Fassin, with his studies on the moral and political framework of contemporary societies, inspire all of us and pave the way, I would say, if I'm correct, to an anthropology that engages with theory, civil society, and of course, with the reality of our daily lives. Thank you so much.
Grazie mille. Buonasera. It is a great honor to have been invited to deliver the keynote lecture of the 14th Biennial Conference of the European Association of Social Anthropologists. And I'm grateful to the conveners of this event at the Università di Milano Bicocca, in particular Silvia Vignato, as well as to the executive committee of EASA, notably Thomas Ilan Eriksson, for having given me this wonderful opportunity. It is indeed of special significance for me, not only because being exiled, a golden exile, I must admit, in North America, I consider important to maintain close relationship with my European colleagues and friends, but also because in the present moment of political and moral crisis in Europe, the convergence of anthropological voices is of a major relevance. I will offer tonight a few reflections in defense of critique. And as I was driven this morning from the airport to my hotel, going through via Gramsci, via Pasolini, and unexpectedly via Engels, I felt these were auspicious signs. Critique seems to be under attack these days, and the critique of critique has become common practice among intellectuals and scientists, as well as commentators and politicians. Considering current external pressures along with internal offensive to which the human sciences are subjected, and reckoning equally the disaffection towards and defections of critiques within academic institutions, one could even wonder whether critique has not entered a critical situation. In other words, critique might not only be criticized, but also in crisis. It is certainly neither the first nor the last time that this is the case, but it is worth wondering how singular the present moment is and what particular meaning it has. However, as the quote apocryphally attributed to Winston Churchill goes, one should never let a good crisis go to waste. Definite contests and possible decline of critique can be seized as an opportunity for a fertile debate leading to new openings within the human sciences as well as within the public sphere. And referring to a phrase this time correctly credited to John Locke, the motive to change is always some uneasiness. Let us then use the discomfort around critique as an occasion for its reassessment. This is the spirit that animates my reflection. Critique is not a fortress under siege one would have to defend, but a land in fallow one needs constantly to recede. If properly understood, answered, and countered, criticisms directed at critique can clarify its function and strengthen its legitimacy. Indeed, the polysemic term endurance of my title simultaneously means that critique repeatedly undergoes ordeals, that it bears them with patience, and that it continues to exist beyond them. This state of affairs is true for the humanities and the social sciences at large, but it has certain idiosyncratic expressions in anthropology. I will examine these expressions in more detail while not losing sight of the fact that they pertain to a broader picture. It is the very status, role, and form of critique that are at stake in these disputes, hence the need to ponder them thoroughly. Analyzing critique and its contemporary fate, I will first identify some arguments frequently opposed to it. Second, try to clarify its concept and distinguish its various strands. Third, focus more specifically on what it means for ethnography and how it relates the ethnographer to its publics. My argument is that we must resist both the facile disqualification of critique as a practice passée and the hyperbolic use of critique as a mere mantra, and that anthropology in general and ethnography in particular can help us succeed in this endeavor. Against the unbearable lightness of being that paradoxically characterizes certain forms of alleged radicalism as well as certain retreats in an ivory tower, I will attempt to give some weight to a critical approach of the way in which we deal with the world. I trust that it will progressively become manifest that through this inquiry into critique, I will definitely be in line with the motto of this conference about talking about anthropological legacies in light of the importance of critical thinking in the history of the discipline, and about human futures as the somber times we live in render this critical thinking more necessary than ever. Hoping that this will not be regarded as an intellectual chauvinism or national score setting, let me begin with a discussion of a text by a French social scientist which has received a lot of attention in academia and beyond, the 2004 article published by Bruno Latour in Critical Inquiry entitled "Why Has Critique Run Out of Steam?" What if intellectuals were one war late, one critique late, writes our excellent colleague, who affirms that it has been a long time since the very notion of avant-garde passed away, pushed aside by other forces, moved to the rear guard. Why such a far-reaching utterance? One learns that this admittedly depressing reflection stems from a series of epiphanies experienced by the author while reading an editorial of the New York Times and talking to a neighbor in his Bourbonnais village, which suddenly made him aware of the unwavering denial of climate change by Republican pundits and the conspiracy theories surrounding the destruction of the Twin Towers, respectively. Could it be, our colleague anxiously wonders, that the challenging of a scientifically established fact in the first case and of an empirically validated event in the second be the consequence of critiques having gone too far or being heard too literally? After all, he argues, is it not the social scientists, including himself, who have claimed that reality is socially constructed and that behind apparently objective statements about the world, one had to uncover hidden prejudices and interests? Moreover, between the discourses of denialists or conspiracists and the theories of Foucault or Bourdieu, is there not, quote, something troublingly similar in the structure of the explanation in the first movement of disbelief, and then in the wheeling of causal explanation coming out of the deep dark below, unquote. Thus, according to Latour, not only have Foucault's archaeological method or Bourdieu's concept of doxa inserted doubts in the minds of suggestible individuals, but also the way of thinking of these lay people has a family resemblance, in Wittgenstein's terms, with the philosophers' and sociologists' intellectual enterprise. They share the same suspicious perspective on the world. To avoid further defeats of reason and hopefully correct the coming intellectual disaster, Latour proposes, as, quote, the lights of enlightenment are being slowly turned off, a stubborn realist attitude focused on matters of concerns, not matters of fact, unquote. Ironic twist. The author of We Have Never Been Modern is now insisting that we eventually become modern. It is certainly remarkable that a social scientist, and moreover a social student of science, would hold accountable his entire profession for the existence of denialist mindsets and conspiracy theories, as if historians had not supplied multiple examples of such beliefs as far as in the past as archives can go, in any case long before the social sciences were even invented, and as if anthropologists had not provided ample evidence of not so different worldviews, sometimes interpreted as witchcraft in various remote societies, undoubtedly before the natives could read their work. Is it not too hastily putting the blame on and simultaneously giving credit to social scientists for the treacherous influence of their knowledge? Is it not granting them too much indignity as well as too much honor? But even if we accept Latour's confident interpretation of the impact of the social sciences, in other words, even if it were the case that social scientists had such an influence on people's worldviews, could they take the pretext of an alleged misunderstanding of their work to relinquish their critical position? Have prejudices and interests disappeared, or has their study become less relevant because some would precisely hide economic and political interest behind their denial of climate change, while others would revealingly express prejudices about global power relations through their conspiracy theories regarding terrorist attacks? In contrast with this disavowal, one can think of how another scholar who has also written about the fate of intellectuals, Edward Said, responds in the 1995 afterword of Orientalism to critics who accused him of representing, quote, the entire West as an enemy of the Arab and Islamic, and for that matter, the Iranian, Chinese, Indian, and many other non-European peoples who suffered Western colonialism and prejudice, unquote, and contended that, quote, to criticize Orientalism is in effect to be a supporter of Islamism or Muslim fundamentalism, unquote. Instead of accepting that his critical reading of Western prejudices regarding the Middle Eastern and Asian world could fuel animosity between peoples and even nourish religious extremism, and rather than renouncing his decisive critique of Orientalism, Said maintains and even expands his analysis. He insists that all societies develop the same interpretive process which involves the identities of different others, whether they be outsiders and refugees or apostates and infidels, and that his book, quote, can only be read as a defense of Islam by suppressing half of the argument according to which even the primitive community we belong to natally is not immune from the interpretive contest, and what appears in the West to be an emergence, return to, or resurgence of Islam is in fact a struggle in Islamic societies over the very definition of Islam, unquote. 2 decades later, as distorted representation of Muslims and Islamic societies have overwhelmed the public sphere in Western societies, This reading could not be more pertinent. Thus, contrary to his French colleague, the Palestinian scholar did not disown his critical theory because he considered it had been misunderstood. He explicated and reaffirmed it. Critique needs openness, but it also requires consistency. Denialist attitudes and conspiracy theories have certainly been my lot during the 6 years I worked on the South African AIDS crisis. In this country, most severely struck by the epidemic, with chilling statistics indicating in the early 2000s that 1 adult out of 4 was infected, the president and part of his government disputed both the fact that the virus could explain the expansion of the disease, privileging instead the role of poverty, and the fact that antiretroviral drugs could be active other than by producing deadly side effects. Furthermore, they successively attributed to the pharmaceutical industry, the white elite, and the Western world the malicious intention to ignore the actual cause of the epidemic and its link with the apartheid, to stigmatize black people by blaming their sexual behavior rather than their social condition, and to use them as guinea pigs to test drugs whose efficacy and innocuousness were not established. In brief, denial and conspiracy at their highest. But these representations were not limited to allegedly disturbed or cynical politicians. Polls showed that they were shared by a majority of the African population in the country, and this was also what I observed in the townships where I was doing field work, as well as in the academic meetings which I attended. So what should be the role of the anthropologist confronted with such situation? Does he have to choose between constructivism and realism? This is not an illusory alternative. In the first years of the research, I realized that each time I presented my analysis of the South African AIDS crisis, I was suspected or overtly accused of being a cryptic denialist or conspiracist, as if to interpret was to justify, a common argument among the critics of critique. This incomprehension then led me to systematically start my lectures with a cautionary statement asserting my belief in the existence and significance of HIV, just as one declares to have no conflict of interest when publishing a scientific article. After having articulated this creed, I could at last begin developing my analysis with a slight chance to be heard. However, I did not have to decide whether AIDS was a construction or a reality, whether it should be understood as a matter of fact or a matter of concern. It was intricately both. Exerting a critical thinking was precisely relating the two without having to fall into the nihilist constructionist mocked by Jan Hacking in The Social Construction of What, or the naive realism debunked long before by Ludwig Fleck in Genesis and Development of a Scientific Fact. To do so, I had to take seriously both the official version and the dissenting position about the epidemic, so as to understand what they meant, implied, and revealed. For the controversy was not just scientific, it was political and ethical, and it had historical and sociological ramifications. Even more than the black box that the social studies of science rightly explore, the dark matter in which it is embedded, or perhaps more properly, which surrounds and underlies it, appears to be, albeit much less investigated, of major relevance. In the case of AIDS, the official theory established a biological link between the virus and the infection and a behavioral connection between an individual risk and a potential contamination. But it did not account for the rapid expansion of the epidemic and the racial differentiation of its distribution within the population, except in the implicit or explicit blaming of the victims. Leaving out the social conditions of possibility of transmission of the virus and actualization of the risk, the orthodox view ignored the political economy of the epidemic, as has so often been the case with medical theories. Yet, the extremely high prevalence rates observed in mining areas were related to the organization of this industry characterized by the concentration of 500,000 male workers living in single-sex barracks, and the installation on site of bars and so-called hotspots attracting impoverished young women from the countryside. Similarly, the pauperization of rural areas and the high unemployment in the cities left many female migrants little alternative to what was then called survival sex. These social shortcomings of this orthodox theory facilitated the reception of heterodox theses that regarded biological and behavioral explanation as deceptive screens, eluding deeper causes, and focused instead on poverty at the risk of jeopardizing curative and preventive interventions. Moreover, the reasons for the success of dissident interpretations in the African communities were to be found in the distrust accumulated over a century toward public health, which had repeatedly been used as an instrument to stigmatize its members and a justification for segregating them. These issues surfaced in my conversation with Black intellectuals as well as township dwellers who were steadily evoking secret schemes to eliminate the surplus population. Political economy and medical history thus provided clues to apprehend the AIDS controversy. The allegedly irrational beliefs so often ridiculed could be interpreted. In doing so, anthropology was definitely not contesting the scientific truth of the biologists and the physicians, even if it illuminated its blind spots. But it was giving existence to another sort of truth, not scientific, but political and ethical, that of the Black population and its historical experience of inequality and violence. Making sense of what seems peculiar and providing intelligibility to what appears to be incomprehensible, looking into dragons, as Clifford Geertz has it, is certainly one of the most thrilling tasks that anthropologists can accomplish, especially in our time of Manichaean interpretations of the world. In discussing at some length our colleagues' influential article, I have tried to unravel certain features that are frequently found in the critique of critique. The irreconcilable opposition between reality and its representation, the contest of the social construction of facts and the nostalgic return to positivism, the overarching tirades against heterogeneous and sometimes contradictory social theories, the illusion of or even dismissal of history and politics in accounting for states of the world, the insinuation that critical thinking might dangerously infiltrate society, sometimes the mea culpa typical of converts who reject their former faith. Finally, the claim that the critique of critique is actually the ultimate form of critical thinking. For what it has been since its inception, and for what it is still, it should hardly be a surprise that anthropology would be a prime candidate for these attacks. A well-oiled exercise, the critique of critique, however, takes diverse forms and adopts different styles depending on the social field where it deploys its artillery. Sophisticated in the humanities, excluding in the method-driven social sciences, demagogic in the political domain. Within the humanities, Jacques Rancière has developed an interesting argument regarding what he calls the misadventures of critical thought in the emancipated spectator. In his view, from Guy Debord to Peter Sloterdijk, social critique in the postmodern age has twisted and even inverted its initial project, rejecting the very idea of any reality to counterpose to the reign of appearances. Consequently, this discourse states that all critique is immediately absorbed and disarmed by consumerism and neoliberalism, as has been argued by Luc Boltanski and Eve Capello in The New Spirit of Capitalism. For the French philosopher, this left-wing melancholy and the right-wing frenzy are two sides of the same coin. I quote him. On the side of method-driven social sciences, whether economics, political science, quantitative sociology, or experimental psychology, critique is less attacked than marginalized and repudiated. Positivism leaves little space to epistemological and social critique within these fields. But its undisputed success in scientific institutions, the public sphere, and the political realm does not leave much space either to such critique outside these fields. According to one of its leading experts, Gary King, the rise of big data thus inaugurates what he calls a dramatic transformation in the social sciences from studying problems to solving them. As shown by George Steinmetz, this is not the first time social scientists celebrate the glory of positivism. Yet, Barack Obama's 2015 executive order to incorporate behavioral science into all federal programs indicates a new advance in the public fortune of positivism. And finally, among politicians, criticizing critiques is both a disqualification of the content of their argument and a demagogic appeal to common anti-intellectualism analyzed long ago by Richard Hofstadter. After the Paris attacks, Manuel Valls, Prime Minister of France, assimilated on several occasions, quote, cultural and sociological explanations to excuses, adding that, quote, to explain is already to be willing to excuse, a rhetoric that is not without reminding of Margaret Thatcher's famous, "There is no such thing as society." The manifestation of the disqualification of critique are thus diverse, from refutation to ignorance, from contesting to bullying. But is there even an agreement among its critics about what critique is? In fact, for many, it seems to be more an epistemological and political annoyance than a method or a state of mind. Some explanation for this hostility may be found in the history of the word. The word critique is of relatively late introduction in English at the beginning of the 18th century. It means the art of criticism, a slightly older term itself derived from critique, with a C, the one who passes judgment. All these substantives stemming from Middle French critique and beyond Greek kritikos, able to make judgment, from crinine, to separate, to distinguish. As noted by Raymond Williams in his keywords, criticism has a predominant general sense of fault finding, as well as a specialized sense in relation to art and literature. There is thus a dual connotation of the word. It suggests negative evaluation, that's the normative aspect, and authoritative judgment, and that's the social dimension. One should therefore not only try to avoid the reduction of criticism to fault finding, but also beware of the use of authority under the appearance of neutral abstraction and generalizations. The noun critique has inherited this ambiguous meaning as the common sense of depreciation and the social background of authority still coexist. So how to deal with this tension? In his 1978 lecture before the French Society of Philosophy titled "What is Critique?", Foucault, rather than directly answering the question, chose to substitute the idea of critical attitude for a strict definition of critique. And to characterize this attitude, he found, as you know, his inspiration in Kant's famous text, What is Enlightenment?, in which the critical attitude is presented as an emancipation of the subject that is ethical even before being political, since the liberation from oneself is a precondition for the questioning of domination, what Foucault names self-government. But is there only one way to achieve this emancipation? Is there a homogeneous mode of thinking that can be called critique? It would certainly be difficult to contend that Marx and Nietzsche, or Freud and Wittgenstein, had similar conception of what critique is. In fact, their respective legacies have generated quite different strands in our own discipline, which are all claiming for themselves the title of critical anthropology, their champions having a hard time recognizing each other as legitimate critics. To account for these differences and settle the disputes regarding what is a legitimate critique, David Owen undertakes to establish a fundamental distinction, quote, "There are at least two logically distinct forms of self-imposed, non-physical constraint on our capacity for self-government, being held captive by an ideology, that is, false consciousness, or being held captive by a picture or perspective, that is, what one might call restricted consciousness," unquote. There are therefore two corresponding forms of critique. The first critique is directed to freeing us from captivity to an ideology. However distant they may seem, the Marxist and Freudian approaches share this same project. And the Frankfurt School, founded in 1923, combined the two traditions in what was coined critical theory by Max Horkheimer and was developed most notably by Theodor Adorno. The second critique is directed to freeing us from captivity to a picture or a perspective. However remote their theories are, Nietzsche and Wittgenstein's endeavor to apprehend how people see the world and make sense of it from particular perspective for the former, Nietzsche, or via common pictures for the latter, Wittgenstein. And their approaches, which imply that these perspectives are historically determined and that these pictures are culturally inherited, can be designated as genealogies. Of this approach, of course, Foucault is the most prominent contemporary representative. A major difference for Owen between critical theory and genealogy, as well as a major source of disagreement between their respective upholders regarding what critique should do, is that critical theory considers it possible to separate what is true from what is false, ideology being precisely what deceives human beings by blurring this separation and thus allowing the reproduction of domination, while genealogy is interested in identifying what counts for true and false in a given world at a given moment. Both concepts of picture and perspective, not presupposing the existence of truth or falsehood, but emphasizing power and language game between the two. Emancipation, therefore, consists for critical theorists in removing the ideological veil imposed on people so as to allow them to realize the deception that renders their domination possible, and for genealogists, in contesting the self-evident representations of the world they hold true while acknowledging the possibility of other representations. Although both approaches are analytical, critical theory is normative, while genealogy tries not to be. Hence, the misunderstanding between them. The distinction between critical theory and genealogy can serve to analyze how critique works in anthropology, although I will suggest that our approach sometimes somewhat complicates and enriches this model. The research I conducted on urban policing thus falls mostly within the critical theory tradition. The 15 months of field work in the outskirts of Paris corresponded to a period when successive right-wing governments developed law and order policies that often resulted in violent interactions with low-income young men from North African and sub-Saharan origins. The study revealed the contradiction with which the police were confronted, since their performance was assessed on the basis of quota of arrests, supposed to demonstrate the efficacy of the policy, while statistics showed, conversely, a regular decrease in crime. In order to attain their improbable objectives, officers are therefore to focus on immigration law and drug law violations, and they mostly arrested undocumented persons and cannabis users, considered to be easy prey. Based on racial profiling and without legal basis, these practices, which were associated with humiliating comments and rough treatment, led to permanent harassment of youth belonging to minorities. In fact, rather than enforcing the law, the police were enforcing a social order. Through their unlawful and debasing rituals that were known, condoned, and sometimes even encouraged by their institution, they inculcated these young men, and by extension their families, the sense of inferior position they occupied within society. As these populations were also particularly affected by poverty and high unemployment and subjected to discrimination at work and segregation in housing, the repressive policy implemented via the discretionary power of the police was a way to govern inequality instead of combating crime. And of course, we have many examples of that today in the United States. Interestingly, however, a significant difference with classical critical theory is that there was no false consciousness among the dominated minorities who were well aware of this mechanism and would occasionally tell me so. Ignorance was instead to be found among the majority, which participated in the domination without necessarily being themselves dominant. Indeed, after the publication of my work, while testimonies from people belonging to minorities expressed the sentiments that Charles Taylor calls recognition, when we say these things, no one wants to believe us, but now people will, they would comment. On the contrary, reactions from the majority, when they were not of pure denial and dismissal, including among French criminologists, manifested a sort of revelation. For instance, a judge writing, "I had always had doubts about youth accused of insulting the police and resisting arrest. Now I understand." This reversal of consciousness may be a not so unusual twist in critical theory. By contrast, the study I carried out on trauma and the condition of victimhood principally pertains to the genealogy tradition of critique. In recent years, trauma has become a familiar trope that serves to account for the consequence of violent events, either collective or individual, and covers a wide spectrum of situations from genocide to rape. The term is used in a clinical sense, validated by psychological tests, as well as in a metaphoric sense, referring to generic suffering, always in relation to a tragic experience. The identification of traumatic situations such as war, terrorist attack, or mass shooting has recently given rise to mental health interventions as well as financial compensations. Closely linked to the status of victim, trauma is thus a legitimate category as well as a legitimizing instrument. We tend to consider it as cognitively and morally self-evident. But has it always been the case? The answer is no. Until the 1970s, neither the scientific entity nor its moral connotation were stabilized. During the first half of the 20th century, traumatic neurosis was associated with simulation or hysteria, and those affected were suspected of deliberate or unconscious duplicity. It is the mobilization of Vietnam veterans and feminist activists in search for the recognition of respectively war after effects and sexual abuse that led to the invention of PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder, in 1980. With the cognitive consolidation came a moral inversion. The deceitful patient became an unfortunate victim. How did this dramatic change translate into actual practice? I examined specifically the introduction of psychological expertise in the assessment of asylum application in France. It came at a moment of rapid decline in admission rates due to a growing mistrust of claimants. Certification by mental health professionals became increasingly required by the administration and requested by the asylum seekers' legal counsels to attest to the persecution endured. The new situation created by what human rights activists called a torture bonus had three important consequences. The focus on the document contributed to discredit even more the word of the applicants. The quest for psychic evidence led to exclude those who had no such symptoms or did not want to expose them. And in the end, the whole process helped legitimize the drastic waning of asylum granting by providing a justification for the rejection. In sum, the psychological recognition of the suffering of victims of persecutions was far from having the virtues one could have expected or hoped. Critique as genealogies thus relies on an intellectual work of distancing from common sense and defamiliarization from what we take for granted. In the case of trauma, this dissolution operates at two levels: cognitive, as the doubtful category becomes a stable entity; moral, as the suspect patient becomes a legitimate victim. Acknowledging that the trauma is thus a cognitively and morally constructed reality does not abolish the experience of suffering, nor does it diminish the value of being recognized as a victim. Once the historical dissolution is achieved, the question indeed becomes, what does it change to have this recurrent configuration, the event, the trauma, the victim, rather than any other possible? The creation of this triptych has two major consequences: providing legitimacy to victims in general, independently of the cause, since any event can be involved, with possible medical, economic, and statutory benefits, and eluding the political dimension of the relation. The account of asylum seekers vanishes behind the expectation of certificates, with a significant lexical shift from resistance to resilience. Thus, with critique as genealogy, no ultimate truth is proposed, but rather a critical analysis of the effect of the production of distinct truth. In fact, one could envisage narrating the history of anthropology, and more specifically that of its moments of engagement, along these two lines: critical theory and genealogy, starting with Franz Boas in the United States, Bronislaw Malinowski in Britain, Marcel Mauss in France. What comes to be known as critical anthropology emerges, however, much later in the 1960s in a context of general critique of Western societies, their values, their wars, and their imperial domination, both material and symbolic. Critical anthropology took on its most typical expression in the United States with the Marxist anthropology epitomized by the figures of Eric Wolf and Sidney Mintz, professed by Delheim's Reinventing Anthropology, and later expressed in the journal Critique of Anthropology. It was simultaneously a critique of the unequal world order and of anthropology, the latter being accused of accompanying and even giving scientific backing to the former, as expressed in Talal Assad's Anthropology of the Colonial Encounter. The critique of imperialism had become inseparable from the critique of anthropology, since both were regarded as ideologically linked. From then on, anthropologists had lost their political innocence. The postmodern critique that emerges in the 1980s with the pivotal publication of James Clifford and George Marcus' Writing Culture is of a different nature. The material under scrutiny is not society, but texts about society. What is at stake is no more the ideology of the discipline, but the discipline as representation. The critique is political, but it is about the politics of writing. The point is not the connivance of the anthropologist with the dominant, but the fictions they generate under the name of ethnography. Critiques question their relation not to imperial power, but to scientific authority. They do not assume that social scientists are supposed to unveil a truth masked by ideology to protect interest, but that they are doomed to produce only partial truth, in the dual sense of being incomplete and biased, whether they concern the political organization of the Nuer or the status hierarchy of the Balinese. Undoubtedly, the distinction between the critical theory-oriented critique of the 1960s and 70s and the genealogy-oriented critique of the 1980s and 90s is too schematic, and there are influences and passages between the two. Yet, Although the critiques of the second half of the 20th century combat the multiple avatars of anthropological positivism, just like their ancestors had fought ethnocentrism and evolutionism, they do so in two different ways. Some contest the political neutrality of anthropologists, while others challenge their epistemological impartiality. But is it an effect of the presentism that tends to prevail when one examines ongoing facts? My impression is that over the past 2 decades, there has been an acceleration of the emergence of critical moments claimed to be radically new. One can think of the ethical turn, ontological turn, post-human turn, as well as the new materialism, multi-species theory, Anthropocene anthropology, to name just a few. My sense is that it may not be just a presentist bias. The academic world is in need of innovation and novelties, and academics are expected to create constantly and label or patent their creations. Anthropology is no exception. In that regard, it is rightly said that grand theories have disappeared from our field as they are from others: evolutionism, functionalism, culturalism, structuralism, Marxism, and a few more. But it is less noted that the isms have been replaced by turns, transforming scholars into whirling dervishes at risk of theoretical vertigo. I do not want to minimize the significance of the new approaches proposed and of the new questions raised, nor do I want to underestimate the publish or perish pressures on academics. Yet, the chronicle of radical turns foretold sometimes resemble the reinvention of traditions, such as the current call for a return to the good old realism. And why not? Philosophers still think with Plato, sociologists with Durkheim, and economists with Smith. Critique should certainly not be confused with permanent intellectual revolution, especially when this revolution leads us to talk only to each other and no more to society at large. So if we try to escape this high-risk scheme for the discipline and return to the core of what critique is, we have the Kantian principle of emancipation with an alternative between its critical theory version and its genealogical interpretation. Is the anthropologist doomed to have to decide between the two options? From a philosophical viewpoint, Judith Butler has argued that it was possible to reconcile Adorno's criticism and Foucault's critique. I would like to take the discussion in the same direction but use another path, that of ethnography, or better said, using other shoes, those of the ethnographer. And I will finish with that. In the preface of The Company of Critics, Michael Walzer distinguishes between those who seek only the acquaintance of other critics and find their peers only outside the cave, in the blaze of truth, and those who find peers and even sometimes comrades inside, in the shadow of contingent and uncertain truth. Prolonging this rhetorical figure, I want to suggest that ethnographers do not have this choice to face. They stand on the threshold of the cave, alternately stepping inside and outside. As field workers, they are in the cave among the people with whom and about whom they conduct their research. As writers, they are outside the cave among their colleagues with whom and against whom they lead their reflection. Of course, this division of labor is as metaphoric as the cave is allegoric. But the crucial point is the following. As critical ethnographers, we know that what we owe to the critical sense of our interlocutors and informants, as much as we know how we shape our own analysis in critical dialogue with texts and theories. We acknowledge people's social intelligence and our intellectual autonomy. This dialectic is to some extent specific to ethnography and even ethnography carried out by anthropologists without willing to claim a methodological exclusivity or a disciplinary homogeneity. The dialectic of the threshold has therefore both epistemological and ethical implications. Epistemologically, it indicates that the production of ethnographic knowledge is neither the mere unmediated account of facts nor the pure intellectual elaboration of theories. It is a co-production in which the author has, at least provisionally, the last word. Ethically, it recognizes the debt the ethnographer has towards the people with whom he or she works, while not implying that they would be transparent to themselves. It is a co-production in which people have their say as well as their limits. This dialectic thus refutes the alternative between critical sociology and the sociology of critique that has divided French sociology during 2 decades, with the opposition between Bourdieu and his former disciple Boltanski, prolonged through their epigones. On one side, Bourdieu's critical sociology, which achieves an improbable but successful synthesis of Marx and Weber, offers a general theory of domination. On the other side, Boltanski's sociology of critique, which finds its inspiration in North American pragmatism, provides a general theory of justification. For the former, critique is the project. For the latter, it is the object. At the risk of some simplification, one can say that Bourdieu considers that the role of the sociologist outside the cave is essentially to reveal to the dominated the mechanism of domination obscured by the dominants, whereas Boltanski thinks that this role inside the cave primarily consists in establishing a grammar of the arguments invoked and logics mobilized in disputes. Even if in the last period of his life, as he joined the 1996 social movement, Bourdieu has attempted to enter the ring, did he not compare sociology to a combat sport? And even if after the death of his former mentor, Boltanski rediscovered the necessity of social critique after having distanced himself from it for 2 decades, both succeeded better in acknowledging the problem at the heart of their theory than in finding a solution to it. Whereas the 2 sociologies, therefore, do not seem reconcilable for the ethnographer, I think they might be. Accounting for people's social comprehension of the world that they inhabit and analyzing social processes of which they only have a partial view is not only compatible, but necessary for the ethnographer. But while doing so, the ethnographers acknowledge both the uniqueness of their approach and its limits. Ethnography is necessary but not sufficient to fully develop a critical understanding of the world. The case of punishment, with which I will end, can serve as an illustration. In the common sense, as well as in legal theory and moral philosophy, punishment is defined as the infliction of suffering on someone deemed to have committed a wrongdoing. Under the retributive view, punishment is justified on the ground that a wrongdoing merits punishment. Under the utilitarian view, punishment is justifiable only by reference to the probable consequence of maintaining it as one of the devices of the social order. In the modern period, prison has become the cornerstone of punishment in modern societies. For instance, in France, where I have conducted a 4-year ethnography in a short-term facility, prison population has increased by 240% during the last 60 years, whereas crime in the same time has declined, notably the most serious ones. The link between crime and punishment is thus thought to be essential for both the definition and the justification of the latter. However, the research showed that it does not necessarily exist. First, more than 1/4 of the inmates had not been sentenced and were therefore deemed innocent until proven guilty. In most cases, the decision to place them on remand had not depended so much on the degree of suspicion or seriousness of the alleged offense as on the supposed probability that the person would appear in court. It relied entirely on a subjective assessment by the magistrate, which amounted to a moral judgment on the credibility of the indicted and led to the incarceration of almost exclusively low-income people belonging to minorities. As I could observe while attending dozens of trials, what was punished with imprisonment was not the putative crime as such, but the embodied social characteristics of the person as perceived by the judge. Second, within the correctional facility itself, the sanction of the violation of rules were often dictated by the necessity to set an example for the other inmates and to convey a message toward the officers, even when the members of the disciplinary boards not only had no evidence of the offense, but also admitted not to be convinced of its reality. In 85% of cases, solitary confinement was the sentence. The wardens justified the verdict by explaining that it was meant to maintain peace in the prison, and even when the accusation concerned insulting or assaulting a guard, to prevent retaliation by the personnel. Thus, ethnography led to reconsider both definition and justification of punishment and question legal scholars and moral philosophers' assumptions about them, as well as common sense argument that legitimize sanctions as just deserts. But the self-evidence of punishment can be contested further by resorting to other methods, historical and statistical in particular, establishing that the majority of those incarcerated do not correspond to the usual representation of criminals, which serves to condone increasingly repressive policies. In other words, the point is not only what is punishment and why punish, but also who is punished and for what. Starting in the 1970s, the punitive moment has been characterized by a historical shift in the severity of sentencing and a social disparity in its distribution. On the one hand, offenses that used to be subject to fines have been criminalized, with, for instance, the number of sentences for driving without a license being multiplied by 5 in the 2000s, and today, 1 out of 10 imprisonments being due to traffic violations. On the other hand, repression is differentiated by socioeconomic and ethno-racial differences, as, for instance, the number of sentences for financial crime decreased by 1/3 in the 2000s, whereas drug law violations were multiplied by 3.5 for marijuana users, with police targeting housing projects rather than middle-class youth for search and arrest. According to Émile Durkheim, we do not condemn an act because it is a crime, but it is a crime because we condemn it. As society chooses which offenses are worth prosecuting and sentencing, it simultaneously decides who should be punished and who should be exonerated. A young inmate once told me, "Let's face it, look out there in the yard. It's all blacks and Arabs. Us, we feel the injustice of justice. I was dealing pot. I'm not saying it's not wrong, but it's only marijuana. I never hurt anybody. I never stole from anybody. So when I see Sarkozy profiting from the riches of a senile old woman, or Cahuzac and the millions he owes in taxes, and they're free." Actually, 3 years later, neither the former French conservative president nor the former French socialist budget minister have been tried, and they might never be. The lucid analysis of the prisoner can be understood as a demand not only for more justice, but also for more critique of the injustice and more publicity for this critique. By calling the anthropologist as witness to a reality that everyone seems to want to ignore, the young man invites the critique to go public. This invitation thus complicates the allegory of the cave, since there are publics both inside and outside. In this particular case, inmates and their relatives, guards and wardens, probation officers and correctional officials constitute various publics inside the cave, whom the anthropologist can address via the result of his research. While journalists, activists, politicians, legislators, the general public represent other audiences outside the cave that can be made aware of what is too often ignored. In the end, the public presence of anthropology, as Thomas Ilan Eriksson has it, is also what contributes to ensure the endurance of critique. So to conclude, in anthropology's house are many mansions. The richness of our discipline resides in its diversity, whereas other fields, let us think of economics with rational choice, for instance, claim a single hegemonic paradigm. The diversity of our legacies is a hopeful sign of the liveliness of our futures. So let the nostalgia of realism and other old moon prosper. Post-human approaches thrive. Ontologies flourish. Experiments blossom and turns turn. But let us not waste the immense privilege society grants us, that of spending our lives studying the world and writing about it. Such awareness is all the more important since between the legacies of the past and the promises of the future, there is the stubborn presence of the present. The least we can say is that our present is laden with worrying specters, disturbing construction of otherness, unsettling discourses on culture and religion, distressing oblivion of recent past, and denial of future challenges, notably in Europe. This is therefore not a good time for European anthropologists to relinquish the intellectual tool that has accompanied their development since the first faltering steps of their discipline, critical thinking. Critique is inherent to the anthropological project, most obviously in its genealogy strand, since their inquiry always comprises and sometimes even stems from a form of astonishment before a certain arrangement of the world. And we know that other arrangements would have been possible. And more disputably, in its critical theory strand, although more of our research than many would probably admit originate in a dissatisfaction or even an indignation before a certain state of the world, and we understand the cost of this state for many of those with whom we work. But this critique cannot be the preserve of our intellectual community. An anthropologist who cannot be suspected for having overused the word critique, Claude Lévi-Strauss, ended structural anthropology by this sentence with Durkheimian overtones: anthropology would plead in vain for that recognition to which its outstanding achievements in the realm of theory otherwise entitle it, if in this ailing and troubled world of ours it did not first endeavor to prove its usefulness. There are many ways to understand what is to be useful for anthropologists and how to prove it. I believe the most crucial one in a world that is undoubtedly still ailing and troubled remains critique. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Didier Fassin, for this.
And you come forward. Anybody? Okay. So I remain open, and the mic is open, so please raise your hands.
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me? Thank you, Didier Fassin, I would say. Now we have time for a few questions. And because there is streaming in another classroom, I will first ask you six if there are, let's say, one or two questions. Okay. I don't see
No
it here.
questions.
Okay, they will have two questions. And we will take 3 questions from the ground floor here, but please be very short, to the point, and interesting. So we will first hear the 2 questions from the streaming room. No, prima abbiamo... We are waiting, sorry, for the questions from the streaming rooms.
Okay.
Okay.
There are no questions.
Hello, Mr. Didier Fassad. Hello.
Yes,
Thank you.
sorry.
My name is Mia Harmet-Komisari. I represent Allegro Lab. I really enjoyed your talk. It was very provocative and insightful. But there was one problem that I could not overlook. I'm wondering if it was possible to return to the last slide in which you represented all of the people that you quoted. I think you may know what I mean, but it actually still needs to be said out loud. In anthropology, we represent diversity. And we opened up this seminar, this conference very beautifully with the celebration of diverse voices. And we really did not really see diversity, but we heard diverse voices, going from the male voice to the high-pitched female voice. And in this talk, we didn't really hear or see that. If you permit, a bit of humor is useful. Judith Butler doesn't really count because she's only performing gender, right? So, what we missed, we saw a panel of all white male, and I think it's an embarrassment in 2016 to say, congrats, you have an all-male panel. Thank you.
So we will ask Didier Fassin to answer to all the questions together in the end. And so is there a question from you six? Okay, let's listen to it.
There is a question in room 6. There was a question in room 6. Yeah, there is, but the problem is that we are not on the board.
Let's take another question from here. Do we have another question from here? Here.
Thank you for your very subtle and sophisticated tour of various constructions of the world in different theoretical perspectives and the way these can be defended or attacked. But what comes across to me most strongly, in line with what you said about ethnography, is that it seems to me your most valuable work all falls within a very solid old tradition of political economy. It seems to me that what you've said about AIDS, about policing, and the other very, very interesting topics you choose for your research really falls quite squarely with what I will call a Marxist or a neo-Marxist tradition of critique, based upon the idea that the work of the anthropologist or sociologist is to, as it were, look deeply at the social order in order to undermine it. It's very old-fashioned what you're doing, and therefore it is good.
And therefore what, excuse me?
Okay, thank you. We'll take the last question from here, and then we'll switch maybe to the stream.
Sorry, but I have not a question. I only something to say to our colleague, and to remember that at least 2 Italian anthropologists at the moment are incriminated for doing fieldwork in Italy. One young student of the University of Ca' Foscari of Venice has been condemned because she did field work and she wrote a master thesis using the word "we did something," referring to people who were doing some protest against the TAP, Val di Susa. And another colleague of us who is associate professor of anthropology in Naples has been incriminated because he was doing fieldwork in Puglia region with movements against the cutting of olive trees. Another point that we organized with some colleague of us, some British colleague, conference on migration in Messina, and we had as an invited guest, policeman from the Digos. Digos is the Italian political policy. So I think that also in Italy, not only in Turkey, and I don't know what is happening in France, but also in Italy we live a very difficult moment.
Thank you. This sounds like a much welcome statement rather than a question. So we might be taking another question if there is any from here. There isn't, right? So there is a question from U64. U64, can you hear us? We can't hear you, U64. Ground control.
In my country, we call this censorship.
Okay.
Oh yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks very much for your talk. I have a question regarding the relation of critique with secularity or secularism. It seems to me it has been argued by Tal Assad, Saba Mahmoud, and so on how critique has been linked with discourses and practice of secularism. Now, it seems to me that Latour, in his discussion of critique, in his paper on the critique running out of steam, articulated the possibility that religion and the domain of what's been kind of categorized as religion and secular critique, there can be a bridge. They don't need to be separated. And if in your paper, I understand you want to dismantle this, are we to return to a previous sort of division between these two domains? In other words, what would be this relation of critique that you propose towards secularism and religion? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, no more questions?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, apologies for keeping you for longer time than I had initially thought, and thank you for your patience. So, I'm gender biased and old-fashioned. That's a good start. So you will admit that I made the public aware of that by putting this pictures at the end for those who were not aware just by listening to the talk. And of course I was aware not only white men, some are not white, but many men in any case. And this is what I realized. It's not always the case in my work, but that was the case today in what I had to say. But I think your you're entirely right to raise that point. For example, if I had been writing about or talking about religion as I have done in other papers, I would have cited other names, female names. So on the second point about neo-Marxism or political economy, I may have stressed more that aspect, but as I try to explain in the distinction that I made between critical theory, which is basically a neo-Marxist theory, and with its Bourdieusian development, for example, in sociology, and the genealogical approach with its Foucauldian development and others, Sabah Mahmoud, for example. I think I've tried to, and in my own work in general, I've tried to combine these two approaches, and even if I did not succeed tonight, that was my point, to show that, first of all, these two approaches were two different ways that had often excluded each other, critical theory and genealogy, when some, from a philosophical perspective, and in my case, from an ethnographic perspective, would suggest that the two instruments or the two approaches or the two forms of critique can be combined in the same research, depending on what one wants to show, which is something that I had in my paper, but I could not. I was long enough and I could not develop. But about the thing about being old-fashioned or these, which I understand you said with a grain of salt. This is what I said about the turns, and I think there's a pressure for innovation, for change, for new concept, and we certainly must be doing that. But at the same time, there's no reason why we should abandon either methods or theories that are, or concepts that we think are still valuable. And it was not against, but it was in difference with a sort of trend that I tried to briefly evoke. The question of the risks for the ethnographers, and that would be the case probably for social scientists in general, but I understand that your point is that ethnography puts you, in some cases, even more at risk than other approaches. And I entirely agree with this. In fact, I'm editing a volume that is forthcoming, the title of which is If Truth Be Told. It will be published by Duke, and it is a collective volume precisely on how the work of ethnographers being in their relation with the public and with authorities can put the ethnographers in situation of risk. And here we can think of Foucault's Courage of Truth, and this is one of my arguments is that there's something specific about ethnography, which is the sort of obscenity that ethnography produces. when you write and publish ethnography, especially when it's read by a broader public than just the academic circles, there's something of a shock in depicting the reality or the facts or the events that you have observed, and in my experience with my book on the police, for example, I've noticed that people were shocked in a positive or negative way, but were shocked every time by very precise description of scenes, much more than they would be by theoretical and broader arguments. So I think there's something specific to ethnography, and it's depending on which topics you work on, and of course which country you work in, something about ethnography that puts the ethnographer at risk, and this should be underlined. And finally, I think the relation to the relation to religion and secularism, of critique with religion and secularism, can really fall under the two categories that I discussed following David Owen, critical theory and genealogy. And as you know very well, in the social sciences, there has been a tradition taking religion for granted and opposing it to secularism, and another tradition showing that this distinction was recent and even modern and Western construction. And so I'm not a specialist of secularism and religion, but I think the relation to critique falls exactly under these two under this alternative between critical theory and genealogy. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Didier Fassin. So there's drinks outside. I have a request, two things. A request by Nomad.It, those who left bags at Nomad.It office, collect them now and not when everybody is going away, please. Second is the association Voci di Mezzo is going to teach one song. You can look it up and join. It's on the event pages. Thank you, everybody. And please come to the drinks, and thank to Didier Fassin for the conference.